Welcome to Special Topics, where faculty, students, and staff discuss daily news and how it relates to their teaching, research, and studies. Well, welcome this afternoon, gentlemen and professors at Black Hills State University. This is the first of our Special Topics series that we're going to be doing here off of campus radio. And I want to welcome everybody to the program. This is Dr. Mary Caton-Rosser, Professor of Mass Communication at Black Hills State University. And we're going to be talking about the issue of facts, research, scientific method, and fake news. Very well-known phrases that are running around the internet and also among media outlets these days. And so we have an interesting landscape today that may approve or disapprove of scientific process. And so we want to talk about that whole issue. So I want to welcome my guest today, and I think what I'll do is just have you introduce yourself.
I'm Nate Deichert. I'm an assistant professor of psychology. I started here at Black Hills in January 2013, and basically my role here is to teach about research to psychologists so that we can go out and study human behavior based on scientific principles, scientific methodology. And I'm originally from outside of Philadelphia, a small town called Pottstown. My wife is from Ohio, and we met in North Carolina. I had been at a small university there doing the same thing, teaching statistics and methods, and we moved out here, like I said, a couple of years ago, and we really enjoy being here, and I'm looking forward to talking this afternoon.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for coming.
Sure.
Okay.
My name is Dr. Ryan Clark. I'm an associate professor here at Black Hills State University. I teach speech and philosophy. I've got a PhD from the University of Memphis. I'm a trained rhetorician, which in some ways could make me a suspect party here, because I'd be part of that group of people who wants to deconstruct institutional power and talk about how it circulates. But looking forward to this conversation. And I guess I should also mention that I coached the speech and debate team here, if I didn't mention that.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, great. Well, welcome, Dr. Deichert and Dr. Clark to the show. I should mention, too, at this point that we may have some other professors joining us in a bit, and so we will introduce them at that time. So let's talk a little bit about your past and current research interests, some of the research that you have pursued in the past and that you are currently pursuing. And then maybe you can also address at the same time a little bit about the methods that you rely on for working with your topic matter.
Well, I've started actually doing research when I was an undergrad, so I've been at this for, almost 20 years, probably a little bit longer than 20 years.
It's amazing how the time goes, huh?
It seems to be picking up speed,
yes.
too. But I started off as an undergrad looking at the impacts that the social environment has on people's physical health. And so my advisor and I at the time were interested in how social support influences people's blood pressure responses during times of stress. After I started my master's degree, I met another professor who was interested in how emotions influence physiology, and so I did some research with him, moved on to my doctoral program at Kent State, and loved both avenues but couldn't do it. Like we were talking about dissertations before, I didn't want to choose a direction, so I just sort of merged the two directions I was going on and moving forward anyway. And so I started looking to see whether or not social support changes how we feel, and then those changes in feelings affects how we respond to stress and ultimately affects our physical health. So that's been where I've been coming from since I've graduated, is just kind of getting a sense of what's going on socially, what's going on emotionally, and how does that affect us physically. Lately, my research is really focused on positive aspects of well-being. So a lot of my research nowadays is looking at gratitude and feelings of appreciation and things like that for other people, or the simple things in life, and whether that changes how we process information in our environment, how we pay attention to threat, whether it changes how we respond physically to stress. So That's basically my research. In terms of methods, I'm all over the place. I do a lot of survey, questionnaire research, asking people about major life events that they've experienced and how they've dealt with them. I've had people come into the labs. I've done a lot of experimental research where I've had people usually do some sort of stressful tasks like counting backwards in their heads or giving a speech on a controversial topic, offering support, measuring blood pressure, and so that's sort of where my background is coming from. So I kind of run the range in terms of the types of methods that I use to try to figure out what's going on in terms of physical health and how psychological processes affect that.
Okay. So how solid do you feel your methods are in doing that research and the effects of the outcomes?
I mean, I think I design my experiments well. I think I design correlation, the questionnaire survey studies well. There's limitations to any study that you do, so you go in knowing that your study is not perfect. And for me, I usually have a couple of future directions in mind when I start a study. So in terms of the design, I think that my methods make sense. I think they allow me to answer the questions that I want to allow, but obviously there are going to be limitations. If you're handing out surveys, you can establish those cause and effect relationships like you might like, but at the same time I can't ethically expose people to horrible life tragedies for the purposes of research either. So you kind of have to balance the well-being of the participant with gaining knowledge as well. So
Right. So for people that are listening and trying to wrap their heads around what we do as scientists, so to say, I think audience members need to know that there are usually, like you said, limitations to studies, and that part of your published outcomes are often address those limitations.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about that?
You're upfront about it, and in any peer-reviewed article, there's going to be a section on limitations. It flat out might say limitations as a heading. So it is not a secret that there are limitations to any study. That is not a problem. So when people point out, oh, your study has a problem or there's a fault with it here, that there's nothing you can do about that. But that's why we in scientific fields, we don't rely on one study. One study is not going to prove everything. We don't get excited about one particular topic or one particular paper that comes out, as is often portrayed in the media, where there's a summary or a write-up of a study that's been done. In the field, you're looking at a number of different studies. For example, I'm working on another study right now where we're looking at the effects of what happens to people during exercise when they listen to music. We are currently reviewing about 60 studies on that specific topic, and there isn't a single study that answers anything. We're looking at that as a whole. So the fact that there's one limitation in one study, when you go out and you do other studies, then those studies make up for that limitation, and that's why we rely so heavily on replication. And when everything is pointing in the same direction, that's when we start thinking we know what's going on and how behavior or cognition works.
So you have longer term series of studies that people do, or what you may do one long term longitudinal type of study?
There are a variety of different types of studies. Like you mentioned, you can do an experiment, you have people come in and you collect data for 20 minutes, half an hour, 10 minutes, whatever. Other studies may look at the same topic, but they look at it over time. There are a number of studies in my area where people looked at the impact of depression on mortality following a heart attack. You're following people for months and years because you have to follow people for that long. But there's other people who do research looking at what effect does depression have on blood pressure changes during a specific stressful event. So you're taking bits and pieces from different areas, looking at different processes. You're looking at the same problem, but from different angles. And you're just trying to get a sense of what's going on and trying to figure out what that big picture is.
Right. Okay. All right. So let's move on to Dr. Clark. What are some of your past and current research interests, and describe some of the methods that you work with?
Oh, the way I've generally proceeded is to find a good question, a problem that needs to be solved, and then to work on it a little bit. So I recall when I was in graduate school working on my master's degree at Texas Tech, that we were doing a module talking about out-of-class communication and the positive outcomes it can have for student development. But one thing that was really interesting that we found out was all of the studies that had been done up to that point were correlative. No one had done an experiment. So I thought to myself, well, why not do an experiment? So one of the first pieces of research that I did that got published was actually a little bit of social science, where we simply took a natural next step to move beyond looking at a correlation to testing outcomes, and we found a significant result which seemed to indicate that the causal relationship, which you might infer from a correlation, that there was a little bit of evidence for it. Moving on beyond that, I did some work on that for a few years, some conference papers on that, but then my interest took me in other directions. I'm a rhetorician by training, so I kind of moved away from that sort of research, although it was fun. And I kind of miss doing statistical research. There is a sort of joy and a fun to crunching
Sure.
numbers.
You haven't done it
looking for
recently, then,
patterns.
have you?
And I haven't had the joys of SPSS in a while, or whatever we've moved on to. But my research interest moved on from there. In my PhD program, I went to University of Memphis because I wanted to work on what we call rhetoric of inquiry, or rhetoric of science. That is to understand how science works as a cultural formation, and to figure out basically how does this work, from a rhetorical perspective. Along the way of doing that, I found another problem which kind of took my attention into another direction, and that became my PhD project, dissertation project, and that was to study the role of intention in criticism. And I took the rather controversial position, and this could get me in trouble, of saying in my dissertation that sometimes when somebody says something, what they meant might be of relevance to interpreting and evaluating it. That's a kind of a gross oversimplification, but there's kind of sacred ground where you're only supposed to talk about texts as critics. So I looked to challenge that a little bit in terms of our own critical methods of how we approach analysis. More recently, my attention has turned to debate theory, because debate theory, while it's interesting as a sort of meta discourse that you teach students, it's also very messy, because we've developed our debate theory from the ground up. We don't have a group of experts at the top who are looking for first principles. Instead, we treat the debate round as a laboratory. Students find something that works by experimenting, and so we accrue debate theory the way that boats accrue barnacles. You shouldn't be surprised that there are some bad ideas that sometimes latch onto the boat. So I found myself in the position of trying to clean up that discourse that we call debate theory, because my job requires me to teach debaters, and to be frank, we have a lot of bad theory out there. So I've set myself to the task of trying to correct that a bit.
Would you equate bad theory to some of these concepts that are floating around related to alternative facts and fake news?
Not necessarily. When I'm speaking of bad theory, I'm talking about a sort of deep commitment to something that's within a web of knowledge. Okay, so something where you have a lot of interconnectivity, and where you push A to B, but it's also connected to C, and so there's an interconnected web of ramifications. When we talk about fake news or alternative facts, there is an ideology in the background, but if we're looking for a particular instance, we can generally inspect that in isolation and say, okay, here is a bad statement of fact, or here is a bad claim which is being made, and then that's something that rides on the surface of an ideology, or some sort of ontological commitment or epistemological commitment that we can unpack later. So the way I would tend to look at it is to say that when somebody is invoking an alternative fact, or we're seeing fake news, that usually seems to me to be something that's on the surface, some of the detritus, that we find floating along, the flotsam and jetsam of some good ideas and bad ideas. And the interesting thing to do with that is not to really look at those as being expressions of theory per se, but if you get into the commitments underneath them, what they, what they're sort of symptomatic of, then we can start getting into theories, and most often those are economic theories, they're folk psychological theories, they're sometimes scientific theories or pseudoscientific theories, which you can unpack and say, well, why would you say that? Or why would you invoke something like an alternative fact? And then I'm sure this is
I was going to
exactly
say
what we try to do in researching stuff is
right.
figure out why people say stuff like that. That's where I think where the theory would come in, would be a sort of psychological account of the mind, why we
Absolutely.
affirm certain things.
Yeah, there's a total psychological connection there. How would this connect to the concept of lying?
Oh, I think depending on what alternative facts you're talking about, there might not be much of a difference between the two. But I actually want to go back to a really important point here, and your discussion there kind of sparked a thing in my mind. One of the things that I try to convey to my students, and I think it's important for people to understand, is the term theory and how it's used in science. It is not in any way, shape, or form the way that people use the term theory in everyday conversation. We all have theories about all sorts of things, but when it boils down to it, it's a hunch, it's a guess. When scientists use the word theory, that is as good as it gets. That is our understanding of how some phenomenon, some process, whatever it is, how that works. So when you say theory in regards to any sort of scientific finding, that is incredibly important. It's an explanation of facts. Theories are better than facts.
So you would say theory is an explanation of facts?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to clarify that
Yeah,
for everybody,
and
because I think that term is really fuzzy, and that concept is really fuzzy for a lot of people.
But theories can also be constitutive of facts. If you have a given theoretical commitment, there are certain things that exist for you that might not exist as well.
I think people get some of that concept from when they think of theories, they think of theology, and theology is fleeting. I've had people confuse the two because they sound the same. So I've had people say, oh, that's like theology, right?
I think there is an attempt to try to equalize or deprecate science. Science is such a powerful narrative these days that we have to couch our most strongly felt claims in scientific terms to lobby for their legitimacy. So, for example, if you take a look at certain debates that we're having, something that's hot today is the question of transgenderism and transgender rights. A couple decades ago, we may have couched this in the language of philosophy or political science, and to talk about the rights of the individual, autonomy, expression, and its relation to other people, and the rights that it's commensurate with. But today, in order to speak of the legitimacy of that particular identity, very often people on both sides of the fence will go back and say what the scientific fact of the matter is. I had a very interesting conversation over the summer with someone who was transgender, and they made a very deep commitment to the scientific validation of their identity, to the point where the person said, I would commit suicide if it were not a scientific fact that transgenderism was real. And while I certainly didn't take any issue with the scientific validation of it, the thought that I had in the back of my head was, well, what if the science weren't in your favor? Don't you still have a fundamental right as a human being to choose any identity you want? But we live in an age where science is so ascendant, in a way it's displaced other narratives and other ways of knowing. And so if you want to take science down a notch, then you compare it to another source of power or authority. For many folks, that would be some sort of religious authority, and then part of how we deprecate it will be to try to mischaracterize scientific theory as being a folk psychological theory or a hunch or a guess, and to say, well, a theory is just speculation. And while there are certainly speculative aspects to theory, theory does represent a sort of web of interconnected knowledge. It's an accomplishment, and although we eventually do wind up discarding theories, they're not mere hunches or guesses. They represent as near as you're going to get to a consensus view of how the world works in a particular aspect. It really is quite an achievement to have a scientific theory.
But the way you get to that theory and the way that you revise it and ditch, bad theory and add new good theory is through that process of, scholarly research, peer review. And I think that's another thing that people don't understand is that, these are not hunches that are just, thrown out there. It takes a lot just to get one paper published and to have to go out and to do it over and over again and then generate ideas about the, like you were saying, the interconnectedness between all the different factors involved. It's not to be taken, I think it's, like I said, it's really kind of discounted in some situations, and perhaps
and probably
part
because
of it
it's
is,
mostly misunderstood. I think. Not understood.
Del-
Maybe not even understood. Not just misunderstood, but just not understood.
Perhaps deliberate in some situations too, because like you said, there are science does have and I'm biased, but I think it should have a high standing in society because it is a great way of learning and gaining knowledge about the natural world and how things exist. But I see your point, and I agree with you that that's not saying that other disciplines and things don't have value, because they do. But the culture and the society and the way things are nowadays, I see where you're coming from, saying, you have to couch everything in science, and maybe that's part of the problem. What
would be really helpful at this point is if you could think of a specific theory that relates to a set of scientific facts in your field or something that you know of that could explain it in an example form for people to the audience, so that they understand that process, the connections between theory and scientific facts. Can you be specific with a theory? Can you be specific with a group of scientific facts? Maybe it's your own work.
Well, I'd be inclined to offer some examples that would undermine the notion that science is just a happy business of verification.
Okay.
I might talk about, with me, a book by Mara Beller, Quantum Dialogues. She unpacks the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics as an ideological and political achievement. And one of the things that we don't talk about in the process of science sometimes is how scientists who sometimes take on unpopular views can become marginalized if they're not doing mainstream science. And there's this notion we have of science being self-correcting, which it is, but there is a general idea that truth will eventually rise to the top. So there's a caution that we need to have when we're talking about science as to whether we're working from science as a pure conceptual definition, which will usually be idealized and it'll be normative, versus an historical definition of science, which is to say how science is actually practiced. And sometimes when you try to criticize a given scientific practice, somebody will come back and say, well, that's not really science, and then it starts to sound a bit like the no true Scotsman fallacy. But then on the other side of it, people who are critical of science will tend to take the most flagrant abuses and try to make that representative of the scientific field, which is really unfair too. So there is a give and take that we have. If I were to speculate the reason why people are skeptical of science or might push back against it, I would say it's how we intersect with scientific facts. If I'm just reading the internet or reading the paper, one week I'm told there's a study that tells me that coffee causes cancer. In 2 weeks I'll read another headline telling me that it cures cancer. If I don't understand how the peer review process works and how scientists carefully modulate their claims, I don't realize how that gets translated into journalism, which has to be exciting. It has to be man bites dog. It has to be something exciting and titillating. And so I think we have a real problem in terms of how we disseminate science to the community, which creates a misapprehension, which makes people think that science really is a bit more variable or more fickle than it really is. So I'm a communication professor, so I tend to think that it's very often a communication problem, and that might be why we have a great deal of misunderstanding, is how it gets leveraged.
Yeah. No, I agree that I think communicating those findings is certainly an issue, because you can kind of get a sense of what studies would lend themselves well to newspapers and news bites and things like that, and couple that with the illiteracy when it comes to the scientific process, it's an absolute nightmare. And one of the things I have my students do is go find a news article and then go find the original source and look to see what the differences are.
That's a great exercise. Yeah.
And there's no doubt that there's going to be a huge difference, because the communication, more likely than not, I would guess, comes from someone who doesn't have that scientific background and doesn't understand, subtle difference in terms of correlational research versus experimental research, what claims you can make, and things like that. So, I completely agree with you on that.
It's sort of like the mainstream public, so to say, often has a fear of that because they don't. It's like fear of the unknown. They really don't know what to believe sometimes, because they do hear conflicting reports from sometimes one month to the next, and then they become disillusioned about all of it.
I don't know if it's necessarily that they don't know what to believe. I think in some situations, science says one thing and what they want to believe says another.
And what they want to believe is based upon
whatever.
Their background, values and beliefs, demographics, psychographics, all kinds of things.
One perfect example, and I think also addresses your question of theories that explain facts, would be the theory of evolution. There's people that are saying, without evolution, biology is just stamp collecting. So you have all these different little facts all over the place that don't make any sense outside of evolution. And I think that also illustrates the problem that some people have when you're talking about science, is that evolution directly contradicts some of what people may believe, and a very core aspect. It's not like, some peripheral aspect of who you are as a person. People's religious beliefs are very central to who they are, and when you have science come along and threaten that I think also makes for some problems.
I'm going to get real basic at this point with some thoughts based upon we're kind of throwing around this term of science. What can you say about the different kinds of science? We hear social science, we hear soft science, we hear hard science. Can you explain some of those for our audience members so that they know what, when I think a lot of times when people think of science, they think, outer space. That's a common one. Or they'll think biology, dissecting a cat or a frog or something from their high school biology days. So they had one class like that, and people will commonly think of that. But I think at the university level, we see and know science in different terms. Can you explain that and address that a little bit?
Well, as far as social science goes, and correct me if I'm wrong, what we tend to do is we make inferences about reality using statistical techniques, and sometimes we use qualitative methods which are not numeric, but you use a lot of different observers. You do coding, you look for things like inter-rate or reliability, and then you wind up spending a long time getting a rich textured description of reality, and then you get a lot of observers to do your best to get an accurate description. Now, social science and its quantitative mode involves looking at human beings, and there's a lot of subjectivity in measuring human beings. I think one of the biggest criticisms you can make of social science research is that we know just about everything there is to know about college sophomores because they're our easiest and most accessible sample that we have. And since you're dealing with human beings,
their defense, they are people.
They are people, yes, and they do have rights, and they're wonderful. But at the same time, they're people at a certain age. But the thing that I'm saying is that even within that age group, there is a certain amount of subjectivity and variability that you get in response. What you get from a survey, even with Likert-type answers that go from 1 through 5, you're not getting direct access to the mind. You're not getting direct access to their subjectivity. So when we talk about soft science, we talk about lower thresholds for proof, like we've got the famous 0.05 p-value that you have to satisfy, because we recognize that because you're not going to get as direct of access that you want, you have to use inferential statistical methods to make a qualified guess, make the best guess you have. When you get into the so-called harder sciences, you get more regular relationships where you can be more confident in making causal claims, and you can be more rigorous. Like, there are things that we can do to lab rats that we can't do to sophomores thank goodness, but because you can do them to lab rats, you can make much stronger claims about them. So it's soft science in a lot of ways, I think, is much more difficult because you don't get as directive access to the phenomenon.
And can you just briefly explain, but just what would be some of the areas that are commonly thought of as social science as opposed to hard science?
Well, certainly
that basic.
Certainly psychology would be more of a social science. Sociology would be more of a social science. Education, I think. So any time where
studies.
Whenever you're trying to understand people, I think in my mind falls in the realm of social science. As you become, a harder and harder science, you're dealing with more natural phenomena, things like, animals, things like rocks and things like that,
geology,
chemicals and so
chemistry,
forth. Yeah,
physics.
And so, like you were saying, the variability that you see in certain subjects and certain animals. A good friend of mine does research on rats, and oftentimes he and his wife will have sample sizes of 4 or 6 rats in a particular experimental condition. Well, those rats are 99.99% genetically identical. They've been raised in the exact same environment, same food, same light, dark cycles. So the amount of variability you see in those rats is nothing compared to what you see in humans. And I think that's the problem, is the getting into that variability makes it really difficult to find some of the things you're looking for in a social science setting.
Okay.
So.
And I just see that we have some new guests coming in. But before we take a break, I just want to segue into this phrase. I'm just going to throw it out to prompt your reactions. Exact science, or it isn't an exact science. We hear that. What does that mean when people say that?
Well, I think that goes back to the point that was made in terms of, basing decisions on, probabilities. Science use probabilities, and that's why you have to rely on replication, because there are situations where you would find results simply based on chance. If you go out and you do enough studies, collect enough data, there will be statistically significant results. That's why you go out and do studies again and see if you can find the same results. Right. So in terms of, it's not an exact science. There is no exact science. That everything is based on probabilities, and so as you are finding the same result over and over again, that means it's going to become that's going to be more improbable as you continue to find the same thing if there's not a relationship between those variables. So, I mean, that's what it means to me. So.
Do you want to add to that, Dr. Clark?
I would agree that the exactness of science would be a relative term. We have some very exact sciences, like if you take a look at quantum electrodynamics or the theory of relativity, they are ridiculously exact theories of reality. So ridiculously exact that it's caused scientists to have religious type experiences, to say, my goodness gracious, this cannot be entirely a construction. We must be touching truth or reality somehow. Otherwise, how could the map so discreetly and accurately measure the territory?
That gives me goosebumps.
How could that, be such a wonderful model? So we have some very exact theories, but then we have less exact results that we get, and those less exact sciences are ones where we have to do probability analysis, and to a certain extent, you're dealing with a roulette wheel with a sample, and just like you said, there's always something which could be a defeater, and that's why it's important that you do replicate studies and that you do investigate from different angles. And I really agree with and appreciate the sentiment that when you get at bottom, there is no absolutely exact science, because there is always something that you could have done wrong. There's always the chance that in the nth case, you see something different happening, and that winds up frustrating, defeating, complicating the idea that you had before. So you're always searching, and that's part of why we moved from the idea of science as being a verification game at one point to saying it's a falsification game, that no scientific theory is ever verified. We're always trying to falsify it. Now, there's problems with the Popperian falsification view of science, but that's a more kind of accurate representation of what we do, and that's why we often describe science as hypothesis testing, that we're always looking for a way to refute the theory we have, because once you refute an old theory, that makes space for a new theory, which is a nice thing to have. So it kind of gives us a view of science as always trying to tear itself down in a way, which is kind of refreshing. And that combats the notion, at least in its ideal sense, of science being conservative. In the best sense of the word, science should never be conservative. It should always be trying to move forward and, find new ideas and to find out where past beliefs were mistaken.
Okay. You have a new guest that has arrived after teaching a class on campus, and I'll give you the mic.
Okay, so my name is Dr. Kara Keter. I teach physics and astronomy here at Black Hills State, and I'm an associate professor. I received my PhD in nuclear physics from Duke University, and I did a postdoc at UVA, and then I did a postdoc in Canada. And before coming here, I was teaching at another institution in Idaho, and I came to BHSU because my husband got a job at the lab up in Lead Deadwood. So we're both physicists doing research in underground science, and we're very excited to be here.
Okay, well, wonderful. It's a welcome addition to the conversation because we were just actually on the topic of talking about the difference between social science and hard science and what that means. And then also we were just discussing, I threw out the concept of exact science, so we were talking about that. Now, before we go on to a few other things, do you have reaction to that?
That's a tough one. Okay, I can say that in physics we can't prove a theory. We can only prove a theory wrong because it only takes one example of it not being true for it to be disproven. So we never have a theory proven correct. And so our use of the word theory does not mean a guess. It means our best working explanation.
Okay. Do you guys agree with that?
Nice way of putting it. There are philosophers who would take issue with the notion of falsification and say there are problems with falsifications because even they have some positive commitments. There would be some who would say that we do have to somewhat play a verification game. And if we were going to talk about string theory a little bit, and you probably know this better than I do, I'm sure, that there has been some string theorists who have proposed even severing from the falsification criterion of science, since string theory is in kind of the embarrassing position of not having any empirical results. So to have at least a definition of science which is just based on whatever the string theorists are in love with, like the elegance, complexity, what have you. But I'd say that without torturing it too much, I think that I really do think it is a nice way of putting it, and I think that there's a truth to it, even though you might split hairs about it. I think it expresses the spirit of science in a lot of ways, where you are looking to find out what reality is saying, regardless of what your bias is. So always looking to falsify yourself, like you said, I think is a really nice way of looking at it, because it always puts you in the right mindset of saying, I could be wrong, maybe something wrong is going on here. And there's an implicit humility in the idea of falsification where you're looking for a way to say that something is incorrect. So there's a lot about it that I think is correct. So I'd say for all practical purposes, I'd agree. And then the splitting hairs probably doesn't matter too much.
Yeah.
So.
You mentioned string theory. If I might split one hair about that, there are some physicists who would say that you shouldn't call string theory a theory because it doesn't make predictions.
Right.
Yeah, so if it doesn't make predictions that can be tested, then it isn't a theory, it's a philosophy.
Right, or maybe a beautiful set of mathematics or something.
Right,
But
exactly.
But that raises an interesting question. I don't know if you're familiar with this gentleman. Peter Voigt wrote a book called Not Even Wrong, and he tries to challenge a little bit the sort of orthodoxy that we have for string theory. And there's an interesting quotation. I'd just like to share it with you to talk about how science can get political sometimes. I left Princeton in 1984 to spend 3 years as a postdoctoral research associate at the Institute for Theoretical Physics at SUNY Stony Brook. And then we moved down a little bit. But the last 3 years at Stony Brook, it became clear to me that someone interested in mathematics and quantum field theory would not have much of an immediate future in the physics department unless he or she wanted to work on the new superstring theory. My impression was confirmed by the negative results of a job search and for a second postdoc. So what I was saying earlier about what I liked about falsification as going against the idea of being conservative, there are still conservative forces that are always at work in science, and there are always political games that are being played. And I think part of what we miss out on when we talk about science, there's a danger of airing science as dirty laundry out in public, because some wingnut will always attach to it and say, "Oh, that proves everything wrong."
Exactly.
Like any time a responsible climate science offers a piece of evidence, people who do not believe in climate change will
Yes.
latch onto that to say that's a total falsification. But the really interesting thing about science, from an historical perspective, is it's this wonderful set of debates and controversies with these
Yes.
flamboyant personalities,
That-
and how it is that these orthodoxies gets established is really interesting.
That's one of the things that always interests me is hearing people's responses to, there's this idea that scientists, we all just get together and figure out what liberal policies we should agree with. And my rebuttal is always, have you ever talked to a scientist? Because they're the meanest, most critical bunch of skeptics that I've ever met. It's like, I wish that people were that accepting of my ideas and my research. It's just funny, and you're talking about this debate, and that's what it is, trying to figure out, where do theories go, how far do they go, what areas do they explain, what different facts are they accounting for, and that's the whole idea of that, behind that replication, is going out and seeing what happens and making revisions and correcting yourself, and that's a giant advantage of that process.
Right, right. So, Dr. Keter, earlier I had Dr. Deichert and Dr. Clark talk a little bit very specifically, just briefly, giving a summary of their research and the kinds of methods and theories that they follow. Can you explain that a little bit more from your standpoint about what you do? And
Yes, I can tell you about my research, and I'm trying to figure out how to tie it into your question. So I work on experiments that are trying to determine the nature of neutrinos and dark matter. And that's why we go underground. We go underground to get away from the cosmic ray noise that's on the surface of the Earth. Once we go underground, we have to shield from all of the radiation that's underground. So we need a very clean environment. For example, if you're going to work in the clean room, you should not bring in your banana for lunch, because bananas are too radioactive. Yes. And
fun fact.
Yes.
Fun fact.
Yeah. It has to do a lot with cleanliness and ultra-low backgrounds. One interesting thing about falsifying our evidence, so these are really large collaborations, and everybody has a different piece of the project. And usually we have grad students analyze the data. One thing that we do is, in analyzing the data, we only analyze a bit of it until we can figure out all of the problems, make sure we can understand what all of the different things mean, and we have the rest of the data is locked up, and we can't unlock the box until we are sure that our analysis method is okay. The entire world would stop believing us if we unlocked the box and then adjusted our parameters. So we have to be sure that our analysis method is the way we want it and that we really trust it, and then we unlock the box and analyze the majority of the data.
Interesting. Okay. Can you all mention a little bit about how you feel about how your particular research impacts society, the world, locally to globally at this point? I think people listening in a general audience want to know, so you guys up at the university, do this work. How does that affect me? So how would you explain that to the public?
Well, I hate to disappoint. I'm not sure it does. It's not my intention to apply what we know. That's not to say it couldn't, but my research is mostly just basic research, just trying to figure out, do certain factors, emotions, relationships, do they have an impact in terms of health? Think that the research I do could be applied to people. Most of my research focuses on reducing stress, so I think there are applications out there. Knowing when to elicit certain emotions can help you deal with stress. Knowing when to utilize support, can help you deal with stress. But in terms of my focus, that's not my goal to ultimately lead to any sort of application, but I think it certainly could.
Okay.
Well, I would think that you can make a much better argument for how your research would help society than mine would. I investigate things that you can't even see, neutrinos and dark matter.
What are those, Kara? How can you explain, just
Like in 5 seconds or less?
briefly, what's a neutrino and what's dark matter?
Okay, a neutrino is a tiny neutral particle that is emitted in certain types of reactions, like in the sun. So the hydrogen burning into helium emits neutrinos, and so do a whole lot of other things.
And this is all invisible
Yes.
to the eye.
In fact, you have like trillions of neutrinos going through you right now from the sun, and you don't even feel it. The neutrinos can go right through the earth, they can go right through the sun, and so we can tell things about the reaction rates in the center of the sun that we couldn't do just from looking at the surface of the sun.
So you say they're neutral, so meaning they're not good or bad?
No, they don't have electric charge.
Okay.
Yes, so they're electrically neutral, and they have a tiny amount of mass. When I was a student, we thought that they were massless, and we thought they traveled at the speed of light, and now we know that they have mass, and they change flavor on their way from the sun to the earth. So they change from one type of neutrino to another, which means all sorts of interesting things to us physicists. But it also could explain why we have matter. Like after the Big Bang, presumably an equal number of matter particles and antimatter particles were created. So why wasn't that all annihilated? Why do we even have a universe at all? And neutrinos could explain that.
Okay, so what's the dark matter?
Dark matter is, we call it dark because we don't understand it. It doesn't interact electromagnetically, so we can't see it. And we know that it exists because it interacts gravitationally. So it influences how the galaxies are rotating. And so either dark matter exists or our explanation of gravity is wrong. And so we're all betting on dark matter existing. Both of these particles were invented because we didn't understand something.
Now, we should notice that as an interesting complication of science, all right? So, and I remember a Discover article about 15 years ago. Where's all the missing matter in the universe? Sometimes you have a theory that's so good that what appears to be a falsification will actually be accommodated into a theory. We know that there is so much good with the standard model that we're not going to throw out the baby with the bathwater overnight, and it makes more sense sometimes to introduce something that initially sounds a little bit ad hoc. And it's a little embarrassing at first to say that dark matter is that we know not what, but at this time it seems to make more sense to have that as a postulate and keep the model we have than to get rid of the model. So and I just point this out not to say that there's anything wrong about that or to contest it, but to say that falsification's an interesting game where sometimes you'll want to preserve the theory or modify it a little bit, and lacking evidence or new evidence which would seem to disconfirm, sometimes we'll try to make that fit into an existing theory as opposed to throwing away a theory. So there is a sort of recursive relationship. There's a lot of interaction. And so that's part of what I was saying earlier, where it's kind of dangerous to say that science is simply a falsification game, because it seems to make more sense at this point to say that, there's probably dark matter that we haven't measured yet, than to say that all this information and knowledge that we have is simply wrong. It seems like we know too much to simply say that it's all wrong, but I know that you know 10 times more about this than I do, so if there's anything in there I got wrong or that you'd want to correct, please step in to correct the record. So.
No, that sounds fine. In fact, what we do know about the universe, the regular matter and regular light and energy, is less than 5% of the universe. So the dark matter and the dark energy is 95% of the universe that we didn't even know existed 20 years ago.
So you're saying we have a long way to go with this?
Oh, yes. Lots of things to do.
Okay.
But you asked about what good it might be. Somebody, and I wish I knew who, but there was some famous physicist that was asked, so what good is this? And he said, what good is a newborn baby? And so I think you have a much easier tie-in than I do. So all the neutrino physicists in the world get together every 2 years at a conference throughout the world. And I was at one, I think it was like 2006, it was a while ago. And right before the conference, I'd given a talk and somebody had asked, what good are neutrinos? And I was like, well, we're very far away from having any application. So I go to this conference and they are discussing setting neutrino detectors on big ships off the coast of North Korea to detect whether or not they are making nuclear weapons. Yes.
Of course, that's very relevant these days, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, I think the other thing too is, just science in general, you don't know what is going to lead to discovery and what applications things have. Because if you look at, the work of Pavlov, making dogs drool to the sound of the bell, who cares? What difference does that make? Having pigeons, if you look at Skinner, what good does having pigeons peck at a light do? Well, if you want to help people quit smoking, dogs drooling to a sound of a bell matters. If you want to raise children, pigeons pecking at a light matters.
So you can use them as models.
You say one, dogs drooling to a sound of a bell, and then all of a sudden you're at the other end where people are quitting smoking. It's like, how you don't know where those findings are going to go. You don't know what applications they have, and what good are neutrinos? Well, we don't know. We know they exist now, but now, over time, it's like, oh, hey, we can do this. We can use this information. And I think that speaks to the importance of just doing basic research and just knowing stuff. Knowing how things relate to one another is vitally important because you have absolutely no idea where that can end up.
But notice how that's political pressure that's applied to science. Justify yourself in providing me with something practical. And then sometimes scientists will feel the need to come up with a story
to defend
that justifies
themselves.
Science, when I think it would be nice if we could have an environment where we could justify doing science for science sake. Very often we have to fall on an instrumental story to say, well, someday maybe we'll find out something about it. I think the story you were telling, I think that was Maxwell when he first came up with his equation where he proved that electromagnetism, that electricity and magnetic force were the same thing. And somebody asked him that question, and you get that wonderful response, what good is a baby? Yeah, you never know where these things are going to lead. And my understanding is that initially with relativity theory, people were wondering what would the cash value of this be. But I believe that GPS devices wouldn't work if they didn't take into account relativistic effects. So ships wouldn't know where they were. Planes wouldn't know where they are in the sky. I mean, this really weird, spooky theory coming out at the beginning of the 20th century that was really radical is now responsible for how our electronics works. And we wouldn't be able to do science, a lot of our science, without relativity theory. So, I mean, it's as much as I want to resist the impulse to say science, justify yourself to a taxpayer for an immediate result. I do think that science does have a tremendous record of producing surprising results and surprisingly practical things from the most unexpected corners, like birds pecking and ideas about how light works.
Do you feel that there has been a historical era that has been more friendly to the notion of doing science for science sake? And to tag on to that, are we in one of those eras now?
It would seem to me that after we'd won World War II, and we'd won World War II decidedly, and there was a time when we thought we were going to have nuclear-powered cars. And we were experimenting with the idea of nuclear-powered planes. And we had this sense that there was a possibility maybe of a technological utopia. And that's a vision that informs Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek in the late 1960s. At the same time, there's a lot of anxiety over the existence of nuclear weapons, which could annihilate us. But it seems like if there was ever a time where the heroic progressive model of science was ascendant, it would really seem to be around the mid-20th century. But then again, at the same time, that's probably, the best of times, the worst of times. That is probably when our anxiety was most acute, because what does science develop for us? Well, in World War II, it developed machine guns, it developed chemical weapons, it developed biological weapons. Scientists out in the desert testing the Trinity device, there were some scientists there who didn't know what was going to happen. Some people thought there would be a permanent star burning in the middle of the desert. Did they do it anyway? Yes, we did do it anyway. So there are certain risks that were taken. So there was also an anxiety at this time. And if you take a look at when we were developing hydrogen weapons, there were a lot of scientists who said, no, atomic weapons are far enough. But we went and developed hydrogen weapons. So at the same time, you can see a sort of anxiety where we get the sense that the technologies we develop through science become sort of like a Frankenstein's monster, that we have more information than we do wisdom. So it seems to be two sides of the same coin. Today, I would say that you have a sort of ascendancy of, there's a plucky neo-positivism, which is afoot again. There are a lot of people who will be like Jesse Pinkman on Breaking Bad and say, science, as if that's a proof. As if the notion of science is an incantation that proves something. And at the same time, you have an interesting sort of skepticism of science, which is appearing. And then you get in that notion of fake news and all that. So it's an interesting time, but I think a lot of that has to do with that a lot of ways of knowing have fallen away, and we've become skeptical and we've become jaded. We've become skeptical about our political leaders. We're post-Watergate people. We've become skeptical about how ethics works, and there are a lot of us out there who, kind of will hold to moral relativism. There are a lot of us who have become skeptical about the when you have like scandals in the Catholic Church. I mean, what is the backbone of your faith? What sort of truths are you really telling? So we have a need for truth and we have a need for narrative. And in an age of so much uncertainty, living, in this era of post-modernity, to use the worn-out phrase, science kind of becomes a sort of island that you can latch onto. And I think there are some people who don't really have a proper scientific understanding of reality, but think that science works, and they have an understanding that science is a powerful narrative, and they will kind of, yell science as a sort of way of, this is my way of explaining reality. Reality is really big and confusing and scary. So you have some people who don't really have a proper scientific mindset who will utter the word science as a way to, clear out some of that scary debris. And then there are other people who will be threatened by the power and progress of science to say, hey, wait a second, there's some stuff that's going wrong. And I don't think we should deprecate John Q. Public too much, because there are concerns that we should have about science. I mean, science is such a big enterprise that it's an historical formation as well. We've had a lot of deregulation, and we've had regulatory capture. So what science does and what science will be allowed to do is also a political question. And then there becomes a question, when the lobbyists become the regulators and the regulators become the lobbyists, can we really have a sense that we have oversight, or that we're getting the straight beef? Like the idea of, and I'll get political here,
I want to now segue into the politics of science, the economics of science,
Sure.
and
Well,
do we need a bureaucracy to monitor and regulate science? That's sort of where I want to segue. So, go ahead.
Say that take a look at some anti-scientific things which have been established, and against the will of a lot of science, but where you have an official government agency that takes on the imprimatur of science to say that marijuana is a Schedule I narcotic, or to say that even hemp, which isn't psychoactive, gets classified as a Schedule I drug. That's definitely a sort of political move that's made. And so there are certain things that happen where you say, okay, well, I know that there is a lot of big, powerful pharmacological interests that are in the background. Maybe there is a reason to distrust some of the medical claims that are made by certain elements in the scientific community. Now, I'm not saying that justifies rejecting science entirely, but when you understand how science becomes complicated by political interests, sometimes it's due to have a little bit of skepticism. Sometimes we don't replicate nearly as much as we should. There was a study which came out not too long ago where there was an attempt to replicate over 500 psychological studies, and they couldn't replicate the findings in about half of them, a little bit more than half. So we've got this idealized norm of replication, but replication doesn't often pay the bills in science. Say something new. Somebody already found that finding. So very often we will fail to live up to our scientific ideals. And rather than try to protect science by always talking about science in an ideal sense, it would be good to talk about science warts and all, compare it to its ideal in order to improve scientific practice. So I just want to complicate the discussion a little bit to say John Q. Public does have a reason to be skeptical sometimes and to push back a little bit, because as much as we can talk about the benefits of nuclear power, when you do have incidents like Chernobyl and Fukushima, and you have some really bad results that come from that, a little bit of skepticism from people who were promised that this sort of thing could never happen does seem to be somewhat warranted, and at least questions that are being asked.
Well, that's a lot. Do you want me to comment on nuclear energy or the philosophy?
Both.
Well, I don't think I'd really disagree with you about nuclear energy. So I guess
Yeah.
more along the lines of the philosophy, and I'd wonder if you would agree with the proposition about political pressure being applied to science. And I wonder, have you ever felt such pressure? I mean, apart from the question at a conference like, what are neutrinos good for?
We're like way out there on the edge of basic research. We're just doing what we want to do. We're just doing what we have fun doing. And we hope that
When you say we, who are you talking about?
particle physicists.
Okay.
So we moderate ourselves a lot, and our funding is often through the National Science Foundation and Department of Energy, and we go through the peer review process to get funding, and I think that works very well.
What if those agencies were gone, Kara, to get to the economics for a bit?
I think it would be bad for the nation because I think it would damage our leadership position in science and technology. And that's important because basic research drives innovation. And we're already, I think it was Neil deGrasse Tyson said that we're in danger of losing our leadership position because we have lost our source of new ideas.
When are you talking about America at this point?
Yes,
United
yes.
States? Mhm.
Yes, he showed a slide.
Or the world.
Yeah,
Listen,
yeah.
He's talking about the United States of America, not the entire world at this point.
Yes, well, he showed a map of the entire world, and he showed flags of the Nobel Prizes. And the U.S. was a leader in Nobel Prize winners up until recently, and it's gone downhill. And the only way to maintain where we are, and hopefully even improve on where we are, is to continue to fund training of the next generation of scientists and engineers and innovators. And I think that requires a continued funding of basic research.
Nate, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just think, in terms of oversight and people being critical and skeptical, I've seen, and I lecture a lot in terms of what happens if you leave researchers alone. It can result in bad things. World War II, the Holocaust would be the prime example of that. So in terms of there being a need to have some protection in place, particularly in my area with human subjects, I completely agree. One of the things that bothers me in terms of the political climate, and this is going back a number of decades, is this lack of scientific understanding leads people to ridicule studies that don't make sense. I remember, I love this one report came out a number of years ago. They were criticizing a researcher who got $250,000 to study shrimp. And there's a picture of a shrimp running on a treadmill. And so all the comments are, I don't want my shrimp going to the gym. Why are, what's the point of this? And these reports come out a lot, and there's talking points that don't get it. And that's what bothers me about the political climate today, and not just today, but also for the past number of decades, is just the criticism kind of undermines, I think, the public's view of the value of basic research. Okay, we don't know what neutrinos do today,
Right.
but who we might need,
Right.
it could save lives tomorrow.
What do you think needs to happen to increase that value, that perception, at least, from the public? What have you thought
We
of
could
some
elect
solutions?
scientists.
Okay, here's the thing.
scientists.
What are the chances that a scientist, a physicist, for example, or a psychologist or a rhetorician, well, we do have some rhetoricians that do run for office, but what are the chances of that happening? I just heard that there are some scientists that are stepping up and saying, I'm going to run for office so people understand. Would that help? Since science is a political issue, it's an economic issue.
When you're making decisions about that a particular area, if you don't have expertise, how can you make an informed decision about what to do, where to go? I'm on our Black Hills Institutional Review Board, so when people are doing research, I will read what they're doing, and one of the requirements is that you have to have people with training in that particular area to review. How can you make decisions about science and what to fund and where to go next if you're not familiar with that field, at least in general?
Well, we now know that you don't have to have a political science background to become the president of the United States, right? So I guess there's nothing saying that a scientist of some kind couldn't run and manage just as well, right?
There's a self-imposed discipline that scientists often have, and scientists are generally careful to avoid becoming advocates because they want to stay pure. And so in a certain sense, there is a nobility which restrains the scientific voice because there is a concern about taking objective science and have that bleed over into advocacy. But for the sort of century that we're heading into and the sort of exigencies that we're facing, if you really do believe that climate change is happening, and I know this is a controversial topic, and that if you really do believe climate change is happening, I do, and you're a scientist, I think that is a point where maybe that nobility has to be set by the wayside, and scientists shouldn't have that cold objective voice, but in fact maybe scientists should be yelling about that or screaming or take this seriously, because if I'm a regular person and I see a scientist talking in very calm, collected tones about horrible things that will happen, in terms of how I read human beings, I think, oh, that person doesn't seem too distressed. It can't be that bad. We'll get through it. So it's this weird sort of moment where it would almost be nice to see some scientists do some non-scientific things in terms of the ethics, norms, and etiquette of science to communicate to the public how serious some issues are.
Now, there's going to be this March on Science on Earth Day. And so I've heard a quote from one scientist said, I'd rather be doing science than marching, but I'm going to go march. Okay, obviously maybe never did this before in their entire life. They work, they do what they like doing, and they don't go out and do activist sorts of things. So that's what I'm saying is it possible that someone could rise to within government that should scientists start running for political office? There is a politics about science. There is an economics about science. How would they do that? Do they need to do some different kind of professional development to help them want to do that?
We need a scientific hero to save us. I mean, I can't think of anything less sexy than somebody with a pocket protector and a pointy head speaking in very wonky terms about what we need to do.
Instead,
I think what we need, if we had better, and I know this is going to sound cliche, but if we had better science education, and not just in terms of talking about the basic class, but to have people have a better understanding of the philosophy of science, the history of science, the whys and ways, the procedures of science, so we truly had an informed scientific worldview, then it would be easier for us as consumers to digest this and to force our politicians to vote for policies which reflect scientific knowledge.
So it's a systemic issue, though, because this has to be worked into our educational systems, and it has to be worked on.
That's a big place. Again, coming from the health psychology perspective, talking about things like vaccines, talking about things like sex ed classes, there's a lot of evidence saying this is the way that things should be done because these are the facts associated with this. And you are running into major resistance in terms of other philosophies kind of coming into play and trying to keep those facts out. And I think that's a huge, huge problem.
I know that the American Physical Society has for a few years been encouraging physicists to enter the political arena. I would actually trust a scientist in politics because one thing that we hold sacred is admitting when we're wrong or admitting when we don't know something.
You think that would be too truthful for today's politics, to be able to be so honest and so truthful?
To be successful as a politician, you have to become a politician, then you become a little less truthful. Beyond that, there's a naivete to certain scientists where they probably get gobbled up. Scientists were suckered in by Uri Geller, but they were not suckered in by the amazing Randy busted him because he was a magician and he didn't believe that people tell the truth. Scientists tend to trust nature to tell the truth. Magicians, they're a lot more political in terms of human psychology. So someone like the amazing Randy, who didn't have a PhD in anything and no scientific understanding, was able to show these parapsychologists in the 1970s, when that was still de jour, how they were being conned. So there is a sense in which there is an appropriate, necessary naivete to a scientific worldview, which could be dangerously misappropriated in a political context or could be abused in a lot of ways too. You'd need a really kind of sophisticated cat in order to pull that off. I just don't think you could take your average scientist and say, now go be a politician. They're different sorts of folks. There is a skill set that you need that's really particular, and I am both impressed, awed, and terrified when it takes a good politician.
Exactly. And how would that fit in the whole world order, too? Because when you look at politicians across the board, across the world, they tend to fall into this category of this different kind of a person that would run for political office.
I think, kind of going off your point, they have an expertise. They get good at being a politician. And it's sort of like scientists. We get good at being scientists. And I think that, going off of your point earlier in terms of characteristics that would make a good politician, and I completely agree, I would probably trust a scientist more than other folks, and that is that they value expertise. They understand that we don't know everything, and that if you study something for years and years, you know more than I do.
How do you think
it's okay to know?
How do you think the mass public, as it currently stands, in your impression, would respond to a president or a leader that was a scientist?
They would hate it. Because people don't like being talked down to, and there's actually research which recently came out that showed when you have strong empirical evidence to verify a claim that people don't agree with, they will backlash against that and reject it even stronger than if they were just told that they were wrong. So there's this weird psychological effect that we have, that when you're presented with psychological evidence, if you're interrogating a person's core attitudes, beliefs, and values, we will protect those. So if you had a scientific president, you might have a tremendous backlash against that to say, oh, you're not so smart, or I'm not going to listen to that. It could be terrible.
And so the odds seem against it at this point. Would a public elect a scientific president? And how would that happen?
What I would say is that at this point in time, I am hopeful that anyone could become president. So I am open, and I am confident that a scientist could become president.
Well, I'm not sure that it's fair to say that the scientists would talk down to the public, because the scientist would be the first person to admit where they don't know anything.
But they may use terminology that isn't.
Well, if we're educators, we're.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
I
think there's
where
a chance. There's a
savvy
chance
comes
where
in
people
and
would say, "I don't get what you're saying. I don't understand."
And your mudslingers would always try to create the impression. And I'm imagining a scientist who would be doing his or her level best to explain terms, not to talk down. But you're always going to have some 24-hour news source that's going to be in a different camp that will sling a lot of mud and create that impression, and then people will latch on to that image. Say, oh, yeah, that's right. You're not so smart, hurdy-hurdy-hur. And then you've got psychological resources to reject something. So it's...
But I heard something really depressing about this on NPR today, saying that people don't value truth, and they don't value facts, and they don't even necessarily value alternate facts. What they value is consistency, even if it isn't true. And to me, that's extremely depressing, that we might have worldviews that don't even care about the facts.
Facts can be scary, just in terms of stress. When you look at what it is, part of it is, I don't know what's going on. It's that uncertainty about what's happening, and so creating stories, creating narratives about how the world works and making it a safe, predictable place. Sometimes facts get in the way of that, because when you look at the fact that the universe doesn't care if you're here or not, that's terrifying. There could be a giant meteor coming to the Earth, toward the Earth right now, take us all out. Oops. That could be terrifying if I believe, oh, well, if I'm a good person and I do the right things, then I'm okay. And the world is safe and predictable. That the fact that the universe doesn't care is upsetting, I'm sure, to a lot of people.
How about the idea of a lot of the mass public being rooted in emotion rather than logic? How can you respond to that?
Emotion's easier. Logic is hard.
We all have a fundamental confirmation bias. we are all human beings. As much as I believe in science, and I praise it, and I think we need more of it, we have to recognize that it's a human institution, and so like Soylent Green, it's made of people. And that means that being made of people, it's going to exhibit all the same flaws and foibles that we're going to find in the general public. So I really think the answer is, if you can take someone and give them proper training and give them a scientific mindset, if you can train scientists, I have a hope that you can train a public to have a similar mindset and to understand it despite those sorts of fundamental confirmation biases we have. But I think it would be kind of a fiction to try to hope to get rid of our need for consistency and emotional support and to make scary facts go away. I think we're always going to be suckers for that because we are human beings, but there are healthier cultural climates I think we could be in.
Now, I would like to separate scientists from the scientific process. Scientists are human, and yes, scientists can have confirmation bias. Through the scientific process, it tends to weed out that confirmation bias. The scientific process is peer review. It's people trying to poke holes in your theory, people trying to figure out what you did wrong, and the theories that survive the tests of time rise to the top, and it overcomes the confirmation bias, maybe not in the immediate short term, but in the long term it does.
I don't think that's an adequate answer, though. And I hear this defense of science a lot, that it's self-correcting. Well, even if science gets it wrong right now, we'll self-correct later. Well, there are convicts that we've gotten off with DNA evidence later on, and some people say, that just proves the process works. And if your point of view is, well, it's okay to wrongly imprison someone for 20 years until new evidence gets them off, that's fine. There are times when science gets ideological and it gets political and it doesn't self-correct as fast as it should. And in part, it is because it's made out of people. And I would agree with you entirely that science at its best reflects certain virtues and certain values that does weed that stuff out. From where I look at it, I see human beings operating in institutional roles, and I always think that there's going to be corruption, error, and chaos that's going to enter into the system. And so there's a danger of speaking in science of too pure of terms. I mean, for a scientist, science is great. That can also become a confirmation bias. I don't know that I disagree with you, but I just temper it to say, but remember, people are doing it too, and it's always a dialectic between process and people. But
I just want to go back to some basic information for listeners, and that is on the process of human subjects research. I don't think generally people understand what that is. So do any of you apply for that, and can you explain it? Or what we sometimes called IRB boards on college campuses.
So human subjects research simply means you're using humans as participants in studying some aspect of human behavior. So it can range. It can be something as simple as surveys to figure out what the prevalence of mental health issues are. So how many people in the United States have depression at the moment? It can be correlational, where you hand out surveys, questionnaires, do interviews to see if there are variables that go together. But I'm collecting data from humans.
How about animals are involved in it?
They're a separate review board, so they do have protections, and we always laughed in graduate school because the rats actually had better quality water and air than the graduate students did. They are well protected. After they were done participating, though, some things happen that I'll put up with the dirty air and water. We bring humans in, we study all sorts of things, aggression, I've studied pain, I study stress. So the IRBs are their institutional review board. It's a panel of at least 5 people from different backgrounds. One has to be a scientist, one is typically unaffiliated with the institution. They can get really large, so bigger institutions would have more people on it. I think we have 7 or 9 people, so it's a little bit smaller. We review the protocols, the research procedures that people are engaging in, just to make sure that people are protected.
So would you say commonly more the social sciences that we talked about earlier would be engaged with human subjects research rather than...
More than the natural sciences?
Yeah.
I would certainly think so. There's people in the medical field that do research that would be subject to IRB approval, medications, different types of treatments, devices for treatment and things like that.
There's a variety of forms that scientists have to fill out in order to apply for the research that they're actually doing. They can be denied.
Yes, And you cannot have any interaction, collect any data from any person until the IRB gives you the approval to do so. The complexity of it differs. I've been at institutions where your form is 1 page. I've been at institutions where your procedures that you fill out, questions that are asked, are 20 pages. It really depends on how heavy the research is at that institution.
And the level of risk.
Yeah, if you're using deception, if you're lying to people, misleading people during any part of your study, medical stuff requires an additional forms
And it
things
depends
like that.
on age, too, if some of your subjects are
If
minors.
I have college students come in and exercise on a treadmill, that's a no-brainer. If I have people who have congestive heart failure come in and do the exact same thing, that's a completely different ballgame. That's basically the goal of the IRB, is to determine how much risk is being put on people and whether or not that risk is acceptable and whether or not you as a researcher have attempted to minimize it. The Nuremberg Code, which was the result of World War II, ultimately led to the development of the Belmont Report, and that's part of what you have to consider is not only do you have to not harm people, you have to really go out of your way and minimize the amount of harm that you subject people to in your research. There's been some awful examples of what people have done to other humans in research.
Is there an example that you can give?
Stanford
Yes.
Prison would be one.
Just briefly explain.
Where they took a dozen or maybe 2 dozen undergraduate college students at Stanford, psychologically healthy.
And what era was this?
This was
approximately?
early 70s.
Okay.
They randomly assigned people to become prisoners or guards, and they set up a prison in the basement of Stanford, the psychology department out there. And the guards, within the first day or so, realized that they can't be there 24 hours a day. So they had to figure out a way to start controlling the prisoners. And so they would start subjecting them to all sorts of embarrassing things. They would make them do push-ups. They would make them, kiss each other, tell them they'd love each other, strip them naked, throw them in closets, make them eat food off the floor. And you saw very quickly that everyone in that study just got sucked into whatever role they were playing. 1 or 2 of the prisoners had to quit, had to leave early. They were extremely upset. Other people tried to quit, but then the guards were making the other prisoners chant awful things while that prisoner was talking to the folks running the study. Yeah, it got to the point where Philip Zimbardo was the lead investigator on that. He brought one of his graduate students down because he was so proud of what he had done. He said, "Look at this great experiment, how wonderful this is." And the graduate student looked at him and was like, "You're a horrible human being. And this is terrible. You're torturing these people." And so a study that was supposed to go for 2 weeks ended after 6 days. So that one of the classic examples, and Milgram study, the shock study, where experimenters, they led participants to believe they were shocking other people to the point of physical pain and much, much worse. And when you look at the original video, these people are pulling their hair out. They do not want to continue. And the experimenter just sits there and says, "Please continue." And that's it. That was back in the 60s as a pretty much a result of the Holocaust and this idea that, oh, there's something flawed about the Germans. There's something wrong with them. We would never do that. And Milgram basically blew that out of the water.
Saying what?
Basically that anyone can do anything horrible to anyone given the right climate.
Due to human nature.
Exactly. Put someone in a white lab coat and give them a clipboard, and we will obey them. And in a certain sense, that not only speaks to how we're kind of suckers for authority, but the sort of authority they were leveraging was specifically scientific authority, which kind of speaks to the ascendancy of scientific knowledge, especially in that age of heroic progressive science. And people were doing things later on that people were having nervous breakdowns afterward. But like you said, the very interesting result of that, showing the flawed nature of human reasoning and how we don't do enough to contest authority, and how we don't push back when we see that something is wrong, and how very conformist we can be, going against our own values, virtues, and our better nature.
And if you throw it on top of that, what was actually going on, in terms of the threat, Milgram's study, you got paid, you can get up and leave at any time, and you're still there doing horrible things. So if you throw on top of that, if you don't do this, there's going to be harm coming to you or your family. It's pretty easy to see how people can slip into these
respond to that
horrible
way.
patterns.
Somebody in the military saying they're just following orders.
Yeah, there's an excellent article, I believe it was in Psychology Today back in, I think it was the mid-'80s, called The Education of a Torturer. And it showed how the Greek police kind of led people to become torturers. And they don't throw you in the room right away and have you torture people. It's exactly Milgram's study. It's just these small baby steps. Hey, can you do me a favor? Just make sure no one's, stand at the end of the hall, make sure no one's coming. Okay, next time, stand outside the door, make sure no one's coming.
So we can see now
It's
how
just
cults
step by
form, extremist groups groups form in today's society. ISIS would be an example, right? How they recruit and
The
gain
result
followers.
is much more terrifying. It's not just telling us how cults form. It tells us that at a certain level, we're all Germans. If we had been in Germany during that time, we would have done, a lot of us would have done some horrible things that we think subjectively we would never do. Was it over 50% who went to lethal levels?
About 2/3 of the people went all the way up to the lethal levels. But what's interesting is prior to conducting the study for the first time, they went around and asked people what percent of people are going to go up to this level. The highest percentage, I believe, was 2%. So people, when they asked how many people are going to go to these lethal levels, only
hardly
2%.
anybody. Yeah.
Or 2/3. On the flip side, though, you should remember also that 1/3 did not conform, so that's not all negative.
But they're still in the minority.
That is true.
Yeah.
But would it be correct to say that in that circumstance, most of us would be killers?
Yeah. I have absolutely no doubt that if you could have moved Americans to Germany during that time, and you would have seen the exact same thing. I have no doubt of that.
So back to the human subjects research process, though, that in working with humans, if scientists do get their projects approved, that in that process they have to submit details of if they're going to be administering surveys. They have to explain details of their
absolutely
experiments.
everything. You say what you're going to do. You hand in the surveys that you use. You describe the methods that you use. You have to justify the methods that you use. You have to explain that these methods are the least risky associated with this particular area of research. And you have to talk about what are you doing with the data.
And how you're going to store that data afterwards, because it's supposed to be confidential.
And that's particularly true for research on very sensitive topics. So anything sexual orientation, illegal drug use, those types of questions, I think.
Or work with minors.
Minors, prisoners, pregnant women, those are all going to require an additional level of scrutiny.
This process essentially was initiated after World War II, or was there a history before that?
The Nuremberg Code came out in late 40s, early 50s
because of
the Holocaust and the experiments there. That spelled out 10 aspects of what we should do with research involving humans that basically fed into what is referred to as the Belmont Report. But in terms of actually having an impact, there were still studies being done in the United States in the 60s. Milgram study, for example, Zimbardo study in the 70s. So even though the Nuremberg Code had come out and spelled out all these beautiful things that we need to take into consideration, awful things are still happening in terms of research. So it really wasn't until early 1990s where the federal government came up with what's referred to as the Common Rule that basically says any organization that's receiving federal funding has to follow certain rules. One of those rules is you have to go through the IRB. And then the other rule is that you have to get the informed consent of the individuals participating in your research, in most cases.
And it's optional for them. Like these people, even if they get into the experiment, if they want to leave at any time, they can.
And that's spelled out in the informed consent
and they sign it.
And they can quit. And actually, the researcher has a responsibility. If I notice someone going through extreme distress, I, as a researcher, would have an ethical responsibility to stop it.
Right. So how does that work, Kara, in your field where you're not really working with human subjects? Is there some kind of review, or what's your process for getting your research approved?
The ethics of a nuclear physicist?
Yeah, well, I do basic research, so I don't do work on weapons. That was a conscious choice when I left grad school. We don't work on people. We have to make sure that we're following any standards for dealing with radioactive substances. We work with lead bricks. We have to make sure that our students are trained in lab safety, and that's about it. I mean, we're pretty benign.
I imagine that in your work, where a lot of it is supported through grant funding, though, in the grant proposals is where you spell out essentially what sometimes might be translated into human subjects research if you were actually working with human subjects. You have to explain your methods and everything.
So like the proposal that we would submit, the first or second page of the proposal, you check off a lot of things like human subjects, animals. It's just that for my particular proposals, most of them are no. And in fact, even the radioactive substances, that's still no, because bananas are too radioactive. So it used to be a concern before I was doing underground physics, but now even the radioactive substances is a no. The main thing that we are supposed to do, I think I have to include a section on mentoring a postdoctoral researcher. If I have a postdoctoral researcher, I do have to include a section on data. There's a new NSF section. How I'm going to store the data, how I'm going to make it accessible to the scientific community.
Yes. So you have to explain that sort of thing, and when you go through the HSR process, essentially you're explaining a lot of the same things. I do want to throw out a few quotes and just get some brief responses from you as we're wrapping up here. This is just a general statement that just came out from somebody. This isn't a partisan thing. Scientists aren't and shouldn't be worried about which political party is in power. It rarely matters. There has always been a long tradition of bipartisan support for science and a fact-based worldview. So my question that kind of spins off of that is science nonpartisan?
Okay, I'll take that first. In the purest sense of the word, which is how I think of science, in the purest sense of the word, science is. Science doesn't care if you believe it or not. Science is just is. So it would be nice if scientists could be nonpartisan. It would also be nice if we did live in a fact-based world, which I'm not sure we do anymore. I agree with your statement that scientists now have a responsibility to make a stand, to speak out in public. And there's a history of that. During the development of the nuclear bomb, the scientists came together and sent a letter to...
Are we talking about the H-bomb with Eisenhower?
Eisenhower, yes. So the scientists sent a letter to the president saying, we do need to work on this. And it's believed that the German physicists purposefully stalled their research. So there is a history of physicists taking stands like that, and I think that climate scientists do need to take a stand, and I think they are. One thing that I would like to say is that this was a point you brought up a long time ago. The public looks at science's dirty laundry and uses that as an excuse to not believe science. I would like to let people know that that should reassure them that science can be believed, because scientists are always testing each other and trying to prove each other wrong, and if they're proven wrong, then the theory is adjusted or improved on. I would not trust somebody who states a so-called truth and sticks to it in spite of any evidence to the contrary. That's the person I would not believe.
And is very rigid and doesn't vary at all.
Yes.
I mean, just kind of going back to your original question in terms of politics, and I agree, you know, science should not be partisan in terms of what we believe. The data is going to tell us this is the correct answer, right, to the best of our knowledge. And so if you look at single issues, sometimes you're going to come down on the side of Republicans, sometimes you're going to come down on the side of the Democrats, and that's the way it should be. So in that sense, I think science is nonpartisan. But I agree in, you know, with some of the issues that we're facing today. Vaccines is my big thing. Scientists have the data, and people are sitting around having discussions about, you know, well, what should we do? The data are clear, and the scientists need to get involved because of, you know, what you had been talking about earlier, just the implications of what if we don't listen to the science. That's
what is the science saying about vaccinations, as an example?
They're fine. If people get these vaccinations, there's no risk of increased autism, no mental health issues.
In children, especially.
In children and in anybody.
And lives are safe.
The only data that come out are, if you look at, you know, the graphs of these diseases that are being developed vaccines for, you look and you see increase, vaccine comes out and it drops to basically zero. And it's over and over, smallpox, measles, it's the same issue.
So are you saying that could be a political issue, though, depending on who's leading?
It's certainly becoming one, I think. And the anti-vaccination movement has been around for, well, since vaccines came out in the 1700s. People were afraid of actually turning into cows based on the smallpox vaccine. And
turning into cows?
Yeah. because
Okay.
the cowpox would prevent people from getting infected with smallpox. And so people are like, hey, if I expose you to the cowpox, and so they did. And people were concerned about, this vaccine is going to turn people into cows. But unfortunately for them, real facts kind of emerged. No one ever turned into a cow. But that story of, what's in the vaccine, that's been around
It's
for
almost
200
like
years.
it's like a myth.
It's
or a
recycled.
Like
It's
a
a recycled
superstition or
myth, yeah.
something like that. They rely on.
Yeah, and I think that's where scientists need to come in and say, look, these are the data, and you need to, respect the people's views, because a lot of people are concerned for their children's well-being, and rightfully so.
Right.
But, you need to make it clear that, based on the data that we have, your child is at much more risk if you don't get vaccinated. Here's all the data. And if you're concerned about what's in it, the vaccines today are much safer and actually have less of an immune challenge than they did decades ago. And these are the things that we need to get out there to people so that we, are using our knowledge to promote health and well-being. So I think in some situations, scientists do need to get a little political, but I don't know if I see that as political in that sense.
Why would someone deny that fact?
Well, I think
I mean, based upon myth and superstition and the unknown. But I mean, why?
Well, I mean, facts are facts, and people don't always base decisions on facts, which is kind of what Brian was saying earlier. That there's a lot of things that go into making decisions, and you have fear and you have this skepticism, which I think in its purest form is this idea that I will believe you when you convince me. And I think that has somehow gotten lost into I'm never going to believe you, because, and that makes me a skeptic.
So there's a healthy skepticism,
and then there's a version of it, which is I'm skeptical, so I can't believe anything you say. Skeptics, you convince me. I won't believe you until there's evidence that makes me believe you.
So are you saying that unhealthy skepticism sometimes is really deeply based, sometimes in values and beliefs and
I think that could be a part of it. I wouldn't even call that skepticism. It's
what would
more
you call it?
Denial or
I think
ignorance.
What you were talking of. You said that when it challenged someone's view of themselves, or when it challenged someone's worldview, that then they would dig in. So I think it's when it's a part of them. If you're challenging something that they think is their core belief, then I think we have to tread carefully. If our goal is to spread the good word of vaccines are good, climate change is bad.
Yeah.
You do have to work with those situations carefully, I think, in order to make progress.
Yes.
I don't think you can just pound it out there, boom, 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 and expect someone to, believe that right off the bat.
Yeah. I wish this
Obviously,
was
after
a purely...
years of thinking a certain way, that's not going to happen.
Right.
Did you want to comment on that further?
Well,
nonpartisan science or
with regard to partisanship, there is a troubling result which has been found by a social psychologist by the name of Jonathan Haidt. And what he talks about in various articles, books, and lectures that he gives is that there is a sort of bias that you do see forming in the academy, especially over the last few decades, where conservative viewpoints have disappeared. We've always known that there's been a sort of left-leaning tendency in the academy, and we know that there's a correlation. I don't mean to insult anybody. We do know there's a correlation between the level of education that you have and where you're on the political scale. But Haidt makes the point that there was a time when it was never 50-50, but it was closer to, I might be wrong about this, about 1/3 you could count on being conservative. Today that number has shifted quite a bit. And there is interesting research that you see being done. There's a weird line of research that's done by some social psychologists that seems to be replicating the same study of saying, why are Republicans idiots? And if you look at those studies, they're really insulting. The mind of conservatives, and then speaking about a conservative philosophy and political view as being something which is a scientific dysfunction. And we have to keep in mind that there is a danger here, and what Haidt wants, he wants more conservatives in the academy, not because he thinks conservatives are right, he's a liberal, but he wants to have the clash of ideas, to have pushback, so that you do have that push and pull between things. So if we were to speak of a bias, there is a potential bias in the academy where we might not have enough diversity of points of view where we can count on people pushing back in certain ways. And we have to keep in mind that scientific definitions can be politically freighted. There was a time in the 1960s and the 1970s where you'd go into the DSM and you would find homosexuality defined as a medical disorder. Scientific pronouncements can have political consequences. So this is something that can matter quite a bit. And now if we're moving into an age where we're doing research into the irrationality of conservatives, we're taking an entire political point of view and reducing it to a scientific description and maybe undercutting its legitimacy and authority, which could create more confirmation bias in ourselves to comfort ourselves and pat ourselves on the back for being so brilliant, for being bright progressives who aren't dumb like those cognitively challenged conservatives who are out there. So I do think that there is a problem in terms of representativeness, but then at the same time, I do feel strongly that on some issues we need more partisanship and more leadership. And I'm just speaking for myself personally, but there are times when I wish that a scientist would yell at the camera. There are times when I wish that a scientist would not be calm, cool, and collected, but to say, no, this really matters. I'm not making this up. This is really important, and it's important that you understand that. And I don't know of how we get past that, but I think we talk about science education a lot. We talk about STEM and it being wonderful, but I don't know that we really seriously talk about how we give people an appropriate understanding of how science works. I really think that if we were to really teach science education, that we could hopefully get past some of these problems where you'd have people who would have an understanding and you wouldn't have that sort of knee-jerk skepticism just to dismiss anything that challenges your point of view.
What would it take to make it more fulfilling, science education, for people to be able to yell at the camera and be able to stand up like that as a scientist, like as you say? What would motivate a scientist in their background of education to help them learn to do that? Do they need to take political science?
Well, I think it cuts
do they
against,
need to take
it cuts
do they
against
need
the
to take
grain a lot of the
communication?
training you have as a scientist.
Yeah.
It's really bad form as a scientist
Yeah.
to become an advocate. I mean, you're trained not to do those
be
things
objective,
because
yes.
you're supposed to be objective. So it's really tough because it goes against the training. But when you're dealing with issues that are so important, so obvious, and so pressing, there comes a time in certain circumstances where as human beings and as citizens of the world that we do have a responsibility to speak up about stuff.
And so in these days and
we're a
times, it's
different
relevant. There was an article here that came out by the Associated Press about South Dakota lawmakers approve a scientific bill. And this was from January 28, 2017. South Dakota parents and educators are concerned that a bill approved this week could bring non-scientific theories into science classes. What is a non-scientific theory?
I would think that they're talking about creationism or something.
If that's the
Probably.
Okay,
Yeah,
state
yeah,
lawmakers
right.
approved a bill on Wednesday that would protect the teaching of certain scientific information in classrooms. The Argus Leader reported Senate Bill 55 itself is fewer than 40 words, but it has science teachers and public educators across the state concerned about how to bring non-scientific theories into science classes.
I believe it's couched under it's okay to teach the weaknesses associated with scientific theories, which, I mean, if you had an understanding of science, that would be a completely unnecessary bill. That's built into the scientific process.
Yes.
You are out there trying to disprove things and show the weaknesses and limitations, and I'm assuming that's what that bill is talking about, and I believe it's geared more towards bringing in creationism into the high schools and things like that. So,
Do you have comments on that?
I'd like to see science get its hands dirty. There's a tendency we have to try to protect science like it's a damsel in distress, like scientific reasoning can't defend itself. Now, I'm not saying that we should be teaching intelligent design in science classes or anything like that, but I don't think we necessarily have to be hasty in putting science on a pedestal because people always want to knock the pedestal over. Instead, I'd make a move like Richard Rorty and say, let's treat science as another narrative, and instead of having science on its hind legs, let's put it on all fours with other narratives and let it run. And I think a thing we found historically is that dog runs really well and it runs really fast. And give people an understanding of science as a narrative and let it compete. I'm a speech teacher, so I always believe more speech, not less speech. Engage in genuine scientific speech against non-scientific speech. Find out how maybe science could become complicated. Maybe every once in a while that crank has a good idea, but I think by and large you're going to find that science will have been confirmed because science generally works. It is a very powerful, effective narrative. It's something we can be proud of as a human achievement, despite all the warts that it might have and occasional problems it might have. I would be inclined to say, great, take your scientist and put that scientist next to someone who wants to challenge that, and maybe we could learn something and come to grips with these issues.
I agree. I see your point, and I agree with it to some extent. The only concern I have is that might give undue validity to perspectives that don't deserve any validity.
Yes.
When you have people, I don't need someone showing up on the news to defend the earth being round. That is completely unnecessary. But when you see it on the news, that gives legitimacy to alternative perspectives. And that would be my only concern about having that dialogue is, the fact that you're having it can make it seem like it's legitimate, and that would be my only concern.
And I agree, and the only thing I'd say back is that there was a time in this country when more than 50% of Americans didn't believe in evolution. That's within the last 10 years. At the point where about half of your audience doesn't believe in evolution, I would say that you do have a controversy that you have to navigate, at least in terms of public perception. And like I said, I don't know that I'd bring it into a classroom, because bringing it in a classroom might legitimize something which is pseudoscience. But I like the idea of there being a space where you have science interacting with different narratives, so we get a better sense of what science is, not locking it up in a cabinet and protecting it, but getting it to circulate a little bit more. And that's always the question, right? We don't want to legitimize goofy ideas, but maybe there's a way to get things to circulate where we can see science really doing its thing.
The problem with that is there have been debates, and seen these debates, and the creationists or whatever the anti-group is will go from town to town debating against the scientists in some public setting. And in that debate, the scientist replies with logic, replies with facts, and they think they've won. The debater, the anti-person, goes on to the next town and repeats the exact same argument. So they keep repeating the same argument even after the logical flaws have been pointed out. And so you have alternate facts. The more you say something, the more true it is. And it's the false equivalence. If 97% of scientists believe climate change is real and 3% believe it isn't, if you give the 3% equal time, then your audience thinks that, it's a 50-50. So even engaging in those the scientists are engaging in those debates with themselves. And it would be great if the public would see the scientists engage in those debates. And when I teach my gen ed classes, I teach them through history. We believed this, and this showed that it was wrong, and so we now believe that. One example that I give is I use clicker questions, and I ask my students, which is more accurate, Newton's law of gravity or Einstein's theory of general relativity? And even if you don't know anything about physics, presumably you can think of pictures of Isaac Newton. Okay, they aren't photographs. They're, black and white or paintings. Pictures of Einstein are photographs. So Einstein was probably more recent. But people will vote that Newton's law of gravity is more accurate because it says the word law. Okay? And I use that to point out that over time, we have changed and improved on based on new data. So I teach that discussion in my classes. But I don't know, I see all sorts of problems with bringing it into the classroom or even bringing it into public debate.
I think
you have to bring it in somewhere. I mean, if 50% of people don't believe in evolution, you have to talk about it somewhere. I think you make a lot of valid points. And there is a tendency, if you have a pro and a con, people think, well, it has to be a split decision. There must not be consensus, and that's a real danger. I think that a lot of the debates we're talking about, they're not really debates, but they're kind of dog and pony shows that are out there for entertainment. And I don't know that I would endorse that particular thing, because I do think it's counterproductive, and it gives you a chance to cheer for your side. So I guess I find myself in the position here of a sort of John the Baptist. I don't know what would be coming behind me to deliver it, but I do think that there should be a way to leverage the public space where we do have substantive discussion that isn't exploitative and isn't just entertainment, but allows for the circulation of ideas. And, no offense, but I think if some of our scientists developed slightly better debating skills, I think the scientist would win a lot of those discussions, put it into a metaphor that the public can recognize, explain it in terms that we can recognize, do all the things that you're doing in the classroom, but and to do it in a way that kind of deflates the tension in a more non-adversarial way, and just allow it to be dialectical and question and answer. And I believe that there is a lot of convincing that could be done. But then on the other hand, maybe that is the wrong direction to go. Maybe we need more classes like the one you teach. Maybe we need better science education in the classroom, and then we will get to a point where we can understand the scientific debate, or maybe a little bit of both. I'm not sure, but I do believe, now remember, I'm a speech teacher, so I'm a sucker for speech. This is my confirmation bias. I think at some level, more discourse that is substantive and controlled would probably be an answer at some level to these persistent problems that we have with irrationality.
Some final comments here as we wind up. I'm going to present a quote again. As you think about your response here, your brief response, I want you to consider the setting of your daily teaching experiences. I think this is really important, and also in doing your research. So I'm going to say this quote, and then if you could respond. It's based in current issues in the current landscape. So it goes, I don't know what alternative facts are, but I think my parents' generation would have called them falsehoods or even lies. A disturbing pattern seems to be emerging. Facts and the pursuit of facts don't seem to matter anymore, or worse yet, they matter a lot and are being suppressed. Response?
I agree. You said brief.
Okay.
Go with Kara's response.
Speechless, huh?
Yeah.
So Dr. Keter and Dr. Deichert, you agree?
I would not be in a position where I would entirely blame the public, and part of the reason why people are skeptical is because they've been abused. We do not have journalism like we used to have. We do not have the sort of virtues and public trust that we used to have, for good reason, unfortunately, in a lot of cases. And I think that some people are trying to defend themselves psychologically from things which are reasonable. There is a lot of influence. There is a lot of sophism. There is a lot of power which is being exerted over them. So to a certain extent, I would say the problem isn't so much with there being alternative facts, but for us living in a ubiquitous environment and people kind of being overly skeptical in order to protect themselves. I think that we've lost sight of the notion that there is a truth in the first place. I think at some point we became really skeptical about the idea of truth, and that's what made the notion that everybody just has their own story to tell so pervasive and so dangerous. So I wouldn't pin it entirely on the public. I'd say that our entire culture and our institutions share some blame too.
Okay. Dr. Keter, Dr. Deichert, and Dr. Clark, thanks for talking with us. So glad to have you on Special Topics.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.